help you, Arnold?
Former child star Gary Coleman pleaded guilty Monday to a criminal mischief charge related to a domestic violence incident last April.
So, Gary, what happened today?
Nothing you'd be interested in. No jail time, not leaving my house, not paying any heavy fines.
You won't look at Gary Coleman the same way after this. Not once you hear what really happened behind the scenes. He was once the most beloved child star on television.
Aunt Louise, you're even more beautiful than your pictures.
But behind that smile and iconic voice was a man accused of assault, tangled in lawsuits against his own parents, and battling demons that never left him alone.
What happened on this last ugly one that you usually have once a month?
Well, they're all different, but
Okay.
they're all centered around me. You know,
Oh,
the
right.
male is always the bad guy. The male is the one that's causing all the problems.
From shocking sexual harassment allegations to public meltdowns and a deeply disturbing final chapter involving his ex-wife, the truth about Gary Coleman isn't just tragic, it's disturbing. And once you see it all laid out, you'll wonder how we ever missed the warning signs. To the public, Gary Coleman was always that kid, the small, wisecracking face of different strokes who became a pop culture icon by the time he was 10. But behind the sitcom catchphrases and childlike charm was a grown man with demons he never truly outran. And according to multiple witnesses, especially women, Gary Coleman's temper wasn't just bad, it was dangerous.
So, Gary, what happened today?
Nothing you'd be interested in.
One of the most disturbing accounts came from comedian Shannon. During an interview and in her 2022 memoir, she revealed a shocking encounter with Coleman that had stayed with her for decades. It happened in the late 1980s when Molly, still a rising actress, was introduced to Gary Coleman through her agent. She was invited to his hotel suite, and what started off as playful quickly turned dark.
Gary was like, want to come up to my room, and I was very innocent at the time, so the manager, Mark Randall, and Gary and I all took the elevator up, and Gary held my hand. I was like, oh, he's so sweet.
According to Shannon, Coleman began to tickle her aggressively, then made persistent, unwanted sexual advances.
Mark Randall disappeared.
Oh, boy.
And then Gary got wild,
Yes.
frisky. But then he bounced on the bed and like jumped, and then wrapped himself around me.
When she tried to resist, he wouldn't stop. She had to lock herself in the bathroom just to escape. Years later, Molly said she regretted not standing up for herself more. But she also acknowledged how disturbing the power dynamics were. It was an early glimpse into a pattern. This wasn't a one-off. In 1998, Coleman was sued for assaulting a woman named Tracy Fields. The incident happened at an airport. Fields, a bus driver, simply asked for an autograph and requested it be personalized. Coleman snapped. He allegedly knocked her into a gumball machine and began hitting her in full public view until an airport police officer intervened. She sued him for $1 million. Coleman turned himself in and was released, but the damage to his public image was undeniable.
So, Gary, what happened today?
Nothing you'd be interested in. No jail time, not leaving my house, not paying any heavy fines.
By the early 2000s, Gary had a reputation, not just as a child star who'd fallen off, but as someone who couldn't be trusted around fans. The contrast between his innocent TV persona and the real-world violence shocked many, and it didn't stop there. In 2007, he was cited for disorderly conduct after a shouting match with a woman in a parking lot. Witnesses described him hitting the steering wheel, exiting his vehicle, flailing his arms, and screaming so loudly that traffic in the area came to a standstill. Police were called. He cooperated, but it painted the picture of a man unable to control his rage in even the smallest interactions. Just 1 year later, things escalated again, this time at a bowling alley in Payson, Utah.
Coleman was arrested in 2008 after a man claimed Coleman tried to run him over in a parking lot when he tried to take a picture with him.
A man named Colt Rushton tried to take a photo of Coleman without permission. Gary confronted him. The altercation spilled into the parking lot, and according to witnesses, Coleman backed his vehicle into Rushton, striking him. Rushton sustained minor injuries. Gary pleaded no contest to reckless driving and disorderly conduct and was fined $100. But public opinion was harsher. It became clear this wasn't about one bad day. It was a pattern. A man spiraling, unable or unwilling to control the violence inside him. Add to this his well-documented anger issues. Gary was repeatedly ordered to attend anger management classes throughout his adult life. His inability to keep calm in public, especially around women, became a running theme.
Why don't you want to answer the question about whether you abused your wife and everything else? Pardon me?
You can go yourself.
Really?
And quit asking me.
Is that the way you talk to your wife?
Yes, I have to, if I need to, but I don't.
For a man who once symbolized joy on screen, his real-life presence left many women shaken. The Gary Coleman the world knew wasn't the man people encountered behind closed doors. This was a person struggling with rage, identity, and the emotional fallout of a childhood stolen by fame. And for too many, that struggle turned violent. It's important to understand how these events weren't just isolated cases. They reflected a man under immense pressure. Gary often spoke about the psychological toll of childhood fame. By the time he was 10, he was one of the most famous faces on television. But he never grew, physically or emotionally, into the version of adulthood the public expected. His 4 feet 8 inches frame and childlike appearance kept him frozen in time. Meanwhile, inside he was growing angrier, more isolated, and deeply resentful of how people treated him. His breakdowns weren't just a reaction to stress, they were years of humiliation and unresolved trauma spilling out in real time. At least, that's what some who knew him would later argue. But for those on the receiving end of his rage, that explanation wasn't enough. What made it worse was how defensive Gary became about it all. He rarely apologized. In interviews, he brushed off the incidents or blamed the people around him. He claimed he was being provoked, exploited, or misunderstood. But after so many incidents, the question wasn't whether he had a short fuse. It was how long before it blew again. Gary Coleman's relationship with Shannon Price was unlike anything most fans expected. When news broke in 2007 that the 39-year-old former child star had quietly married a 22-year-old woman he met on the set of a low-budget movie, jaws dropped. The age difference was one thing, but it wasn't long before the public learned that what went on behind closed doors made the age gap seem like the least of their issues. They met while filming Church Ball, a 2006 comedy that came and went without fanfare. Gary was living in Utah, far removed from his LA celebrity days, and Shannon was a production assistant. They fell into a whirlwind romance and, without much notice, tied the knot in a private mountain ceremony. But rather than feel like a fresh start, the marriage quickly became one of the most unstable chapters in Gary's already chaotic life. From the beginning, the relationship was combative. Arguments were constant, and neighbors reportedly heard screaming matches erupt regularly. Gary's explosive temper didn't stop at fans or strangers. It extended into his home. Friends said their fights were toxic and deeply personal, often escalating into physical or near-violent confrontations.
If people would want to believe that I assault my wife at 4'7" and she's 5'6", then they can believe that all day long. I don't care.
Well, why don't you flat out deny it then, right here? Because otherwise everyone's going to look at this and say he's waffling around and he probably did it.
In 2009, just 2 years after their wedding, police were called to their home. This time, it was Shannon who was arrested for domestic violence. Reports said the altercation turned physical, and both Gary and Shannon were cited for disorderly conduct. Gary downplayed the event publicly, but it wasn't the first time, and wouldn't be the last, that their volatile dynamic made headlines. Some sources close to the couple claimed they used their fights to manipulate each other emotionally, using violence and threats as leverage. At the center of the chaos was power and money. Even though Gary was no longer a household name, he was still worth something to the tabloid press. The couple sold footage of their home life to media outlets. In 2008, they even appeared on divorce court, not for a legal separation, but to air their grievances for money. During that episode, the tension was undeniable. Shannon accused Gary of being controlling, emotionally abusive, and constantly angry.
They're all centered around me. You know, the male is always the bad guy. The male is the one that's causing all the problems.
Gary, in turn, said Shannon didn't understand his health needs, that she was manipulative, and that she used his fame to her advantage. The two officially divorced in 2008, but strangely continued to live together. Shannon claimed it was for financial and logistical reasons, but others believed it was a toxic attachment they couldn't break. Their bond wasn't romantic anymore. It was a codependent collision between two unstable people locked in a private war. Shannon was often painted as the villain, someone who had preyed on a vulnerable, sick man with fame and financial troubles. But others saw it differently. Gary, even in poor health, was known to be stubborn, controlling, and often violent. No one could tell who was manipulating whom. What was clear was that their relationship wasn't built on love. It was built on chaos. By 2010, Gary's health was rapidly deteriorating, and the situation in their home was becoming more erratic. Shannon still had medical power of attorney, despite their divorce, and would later use that authority to make the most controversial decision of her life. But even before that fateful moment, people had begun questioning her intentions and his. Friends and industry insiders often whispered that Gary was a man who never truly trusted anyone, and that he clung to Shannon not out of love, but out of fear of abandonment. He'd already lost his parents, his fortune, his fame. Shannon was the last constant, even if that constant was killing him slowly. Whatever their intentions, the result was the same. A man with severe health issues living in a pressure cooker of unresolved trauma, mistrust, and dysfunction. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. Before he ever exploded in public or made headlines for his violent outbursts, Gary Coleman was just a kid who had made more money than most adults ever dream of. At the height of Different Strokes, Gary was earning up to $100,000 per episode, the highest-paid child actor on television. He'd become a household name, and his face was printed on lunchboxes, comic books, and toys. But by the time he reached his 20s, the fortune was gone. And worse, so was the trust. Gary's most heartbreaking legal battle wasn't with a stranger. It was with his parents. As Gary Coleman's stardom soared in the late 1970s and early 1980s, so did his income. At just 10 years old, he was earning more than most adults, reportedly up to $100,000 per episode for Different Strokes. Between syndication, merchandising, and guest appearances, he was pulling in millions. But like many child actors, Gary wasn't in control of his fortune. That responsibility was left to his parents, Edmonia and W.G. Coleman, and his business advisor, a man named Anita DeThomas. On paper, they were supposed to safeguard his earnings and set him up for a stable future. In reality, Gary later said they treated his income like a family ATM. As the years passed and the show began to wane in popularity, Gary started to realize that something didn't add up. Despite years of working, endorsements, and press tours, he wasn't seeing the financial security he expected. In 1989, at the age of 21, Gary filed a $3.8 million lawsuit against his parents and his former manager, accusing them of stealing and mismanaging his trust fund. He claimed that nearly $1 million had been misappropriated without his consent, money that was supposed to be locked away under California's Coogan law, which mandates that a portion of child actors' earnings be set aside until adulthood. Gary said the trio had not only dipped into those protected accounts, but had also spent money recklessly, using his fame to enrich themselves while leaving him in the dark. The legal battle dragged on for 4 years. It became a media circus, not just because of the money involved, but because of what it said about family, mistrust, and exploitation. The tabloids painted a picture of a child star betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Gary didn't hold back in court either. He testified that his relationship with his parents had become cold, transactional, and adversarial. "They see me as a paycheck," he said in an interview at the time, "not as a son." In 1993, the court sided with Gary. He was awarded approximately $1.3 million, a moral victory perhaps, but far less than what he believed had been taken from him, and far too late. The money couldn't buy back the years of resentment, mistrust, or emotional damage. In fact, by the time he won the case, Gary was already in debt due to medical bills and a dwindling career. He had to file for bankruptcy shortly afterward, citing over $70,000 in unpaid hospital fees related to his kidney disease and other financial obligations. So even though the judgment had gone in his favor, Gary still walked away feeling robbed. Not just of money, but of stability, family, and peace of mind. What made the betrayal worse was the aftermath. His parents publicly denied any wrongdoing, insisting they had only ever acted in his best interest. But Gary was unmoved. He cut off all contact with them and would later go on record saying he wanted nothing to do with them. When asked if he would ever reconcile, he replied coldly, "I don't have parents." Even when he was hospitalized later in life, they were not allowed to visit. Not because of hospital policy, but because Gary made it clear they were not welcome. And his bitterness didn't stop there. In 1990, Gary went a step further and sued his mother again, this time for malicious prosecution. She had tried to appoint a conservator to control his affairs, arguing he wasn't mentally fit to handle his finances. Gary fought back, accusing her of trying to seize control just to get revenge for the earlier lawsuit. That case didn't go far, but it made headlines, adding to the growing picture of a man who was alone, angry, and cornered by everyone he once trusted. But the courts weren't done with Gary. Throughout the 2000s, his name kept resurfacing in police reports, not just for his public outbursts, but also because of new lawsuits tied to reckless behavior. He faced fines, citations, and ongoing financial strain due to legal fees. He once told a reporter that after all he'd earned in the 80s, he was now barely scraping by. "People think I'm rich," he said, "but I can't even pay for my medical bills." And then there was the work, or lack of it. Despite his fame, Gary struggled to get hired. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him. He was too recognizable to be cast in a new role and too controversial to be trusted on set. Even when he did land a job, it often felt more like a joke than a comeback. He made brief appearances on The Simpsons, Robot Chicken, and VH1 reality shows, all treating him like a punchline instead of a person. His anger only grew. So did his isolation. At one point, Gary admitted that his health costs alone were eating up most of his income. Between dialysis sessions, prescription medications, and checkups for his lifelong kidney condition, he had little left. He never stopped blaming his parents, and his parents never stopped insisting they did nothing wrong. Gary Coleman's final days were as murky and heartbreaking as the rest of his life. On May 26, 2010, a 911 call from his Utah home sent shockwaves through the media. His ex-wife, Shannon Price, was on the line, panicked. She told the operator Gary had suffered a fall and was bleeding from the back of his head. She begged for help, saying she couldn't go near him because she can't stand blood.
Send someone quick, because I don't even know if he's going to be alive, because there's a lot of blood on the floor.
He was rushed to Utah Valley Regional Medical Center. The injury was severe. Doctors later confirmed that Gary had suffered an epidural hematoma, a brain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma. Within 24 hours, he was in critical condition, unconscious, and placed on life support. At just 42 years old, Gary's life was hanging by a thread. But this is where the story stops being simple and starts raising eyebrows. The decision to take Gary off life support wasn't made by a sibling or spouse. It was made by Shannon Price. the same woman he had divorced 2 years earlier. And yet, somehow, she still had medical power of attorney. She gave the hospital permission to pull the plug just 1 day after he was admitted.
The death of a child star, Gary Coleman, who as a boy provided so much amusement, so many laughs on the hit show Different Strokes, died today in a Utah hospital 2 days after suffering a
Price insisted they were still close, still living together, and still common law married, a term she hoped would hold up in court. But legally, she wasn't his wife. She wasn't listed in his will. She wasn't a blood relative. And when fans and reporters looked closer, a different picture began to form. One of a man possibly taken advantage of, right up until his final breath. Suspicion swirled. Critics questioned why Price would act so quickly, especially without notifying Gary's estranged family. Others pointed out that her behavior in interviews after his death was disturbingly casual. Just days after Gary passed, Shannon did a televised interview in the same house where he'd fallen. Bloodstains still visible on the floor behind her. The backlash was immediate. Viewers called it insensitive. Others called it incriminating. Shannon maintained her innocence, saying she loved Gary and only wanted to end his suffering. But for many, her decision didn't sit right. Why didn't she wait? Why didn't she consult other family or legal representatives? Why did she allow cameras into the house so soon? The drama didn't end with his death. A bitter estate battle erupted. Shannon claimed she was entitled to everything. His belongings, his image rights, even what little money remained. But Gary's 2005 will told a different story. It named Anna Gray, his former assistant and longtime friend, as the sole beneficiary and executor. Shannon, it seemed, had been completely cut out. A Utah judge later ruled that Shannon and Gary were not in a common-law marriage, effectively blocking her from accessing his estate. She got nothing. But the court battle dragged on for years, draining what little remained of Gary's assets in legal fees and disputes. Even in death, Gary Coleman couldn't find peace. His remains were cremated, and for years, his ashes weren't publicly buried. There were debates over where he should rest. His legacy, once one of innocent charm and childhood fame, had become tangled in lawsuits, bad blood, and unanswered questions. And while some fans tried to remember the smiling kid with the famous catchphrase, others couldn't forget the man Gary became. Angry, paranoid, and broken by the very machine that once made him famous. The fall that took Gary's life may have happened in seconds, but the damage that led to it had been building for decades. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.